just a tournament winner. The pressure's on.
Playing around each other right now. Armada not giving him anything. Not
but he gets hit.
He gets
that could be it.
To reset the bracket.
The reset.
Reads the double jump. Waits out the air dodge. And Armada, he's got to play one more set. Hungrybox sitting back down.
What you just witnessed was an event from a tournament known as EVO, one of the most popular and highly respected fighting game tournament organizations in the world. Two of competitive Melee's top players, Hungrybox and Armada, are competing in grand finals to see who will be crowned this year's EVO champion. Hungrybox, a player who solo mains Jigglypuff and is deemed the best Puff player in the world, came into this grand finals viewed by many as the least favorite to win. This mainly came down to the fact that his opponent, Armada, seemed to have all the answers to Hbox's Puff, and won the vast majority of their sets they played in recent events. When their rivalry began isn't entirely clear, however what we do know is that it started somewhere around EVO 2014, with Hungrybox taking a 3-2 victory in a close grand finals match. A moment that helped kickstart a completely new era of sheer dominance from Armada, an Armada that would go on to beat Hungrybox for 3 out of the next 4 grand finals sets they would play coming into EVO 2016. Going into this tournament, it was looking like another victory for a seemingly unstoppable Armada at the time. He had climbed through all the top players in winner's side of the bracket and was already in grand finals before anyone knew it. Hungrybox, on the other hand, almost lost any chance to compete after a disappointing loss against Plup early on, but quickly brought himself back from the losers bracket all the way into grand finals once again, where Armada had been awaiting his arrival. This time around, though, things were feeling a bit different for Hungrybox. He had come into EVO this year with a few new tricks up his sleeve for Armada, and had built quite a reputation for clutching out incredibly close sets against other opponents.
Gets hit with a back air. He's not in a good spot right now, I can tell you, ladies and gents.
Both states.
A big back air! Rest! Rest! It's over!
Oh my
Hungrybox with his hands on his head! It's over!
He now also had tons of prior experience against Armada's Fox, and was increasingly getting better at countering this intense matchup.
What is happening to Melee? What is going on?
Yo, man. Everyone wants that money.
That shmoney.
That shmoney, baby.
Shmoney. Oh!
Ah! Oh! What? Oh my God! He gets the read, and he gets the and Hbox. What? How is he so clutch?
I don't know.
How is he so
I
clutch?
don't know. That was crazy.
Did he jump on Crunch?
By this, it started to become clear that if there was anybody who was going to beat Armada this year, it was going to be Hungrybox. However, since he came from the loser's side bracket, he was going to have to beat Armada 2 sets in a row in order to take the title, a feat that little to no people thought even to be possible at the time. Throughout the sets, Hbox seemed to be playing with more confidence than he ever had against his biggest rival, and on the biggest stage no less. After 9 close matches and an insane bracket reset, it was now Game 5 of the final set, the very last match to determine who would be the victor of the whole tournament. After taking an early lead, things were beginning to look promising for Hungrybox. He had a full stock lead and didn't have much damage taken either, a pretty comfortable lead in terms of competitive melee. But then, Armada began to come back.
Yes. They are up there. That'll do it. Armada's got one last chance in life.
Energy must go to the skies.
By the end, it had become a last stock situation. However, Hungrybox was miles ahead in terms of damage, and just a few more big hits to Armada and the tournament would be all his. And by the end, Hungrybox did the unthinkable.
Eats a back air. This is big. He recovers. Tournament winner.
Hungrybox presses forward on the gray stick, and that's the end of EVO 2016. Hungrybox put a miraculous win in set 1 of Grand Finals, and able to beat Armada on such...
He did it. He finally broke through his toughest opponent yet on the biggest stage in front of thousands of viewers from all around the world. One of the most astonishing moments in one of the most astonishing fighting games of all time. EVO 2016 still remains as the biggest tournament in all of competitive Melee, not just in terms of viewership, but overall player attendance and overall funding as well. This is Melee. Super Super Smash Bros. Melee is the second iteration of Nintendo's mainline series Super Smash Bros. And has been in existence for a little over 20 years now, coming up on its 21st anniversary on the 21st of November and celebrating over 2 decades of competitive play. It's been deemed as one of the most technical and fast-paced fighting games out there, even being called so by its creator Masahiro Sakurai, who openly views Melee as the speediest and most mechanically inclined edition of the Smash Bros. Saga. Today, I want to take a deep dive into Melee and explain my thoughts on why I think this game is a true masterpiece of competitive gaming, and why I think Melee has the potential to keep living on for many years to come. The reason I showed the final moments of EVO 2016 was not only because I thought it was a really awesome moment, but because I think it acts as a really nice parallel to how Melee has been interpreted by the rest of the world throughout its history. Melee came into existence shining with popularity and had a very lively competitive scene, but after due time began to develop a bad reputation and a notably toxic stigma from the rest of the fighting game communities. People didn't seem to like anything about this game. The characters, the combos, the top players, the game's more casual appeal, you name it. Basically everything they could think of at the time was going to be held against Melee in some way in hopes that they would finally one day kill the game. The Melee community never gave up on their game though, and eventually, things did begin to change. Despite all the hate and backlash that Melee went through for a long period of time, the community kept fighting the odds, and just like Hungrybox, it ultimately came out on top. Things weren't always this good for Melee, however, because when it came to the development of the game back in 2000, calling it a mess would be a pretty big understatement. Sakurai held the position as lead producer of the studio, and everyone assigned to the development team knew that he wanted to make this his biggest project yet. This was Sakurai's first time ever producing a video game on a disc instead of a cartridge, which opened an unbelievable amount of possibility, and he wanted to do everything he could to make the most out of this opportunity he had. He spent almost every day of development dedicating his time to directing and leading the company's most innovative project yet, even skipping most people's regular vacation times for the sake of finishing the final aspects of the game's intro. It was a pretty grueling development process to say the least, but the final product was nothing short of an absolute gem. The development company, HAL Laboratories, developed Melee in Chiyoda, Tokyo of Japan. The staff notably suffered pretty serious working conditions. Not only was Sakurai very specific in how he wanted each aspect of the game to look, but the team had to spend a large part of development feeling immense background pressure from the time constraints they had on top of this. Due to this unfortunate time crunch, many of Sakurai's original plans had to be discontinued to finish out the more important aspects of the game. When asked in an interview, Sakurai himself stated that there were plans of having tons more characters in Melee, and if he had time to include one more during development, it would have understandably been Wario from the Super Mario Bros. Franchise. It's common knowledge by now that Melee had to be developed in only 13 months so it could be the release title with the upcoming console, the Nintendo Gamecube. The Gamecube itself was already a bit of a niche console in comparison to the giants that followed its release. It only sold a little over 21 million units, which sounds like a lot until you realize that's only a little more than half of its predecessor, which sold 32 million consoles worldwide. The Gamecube still came out to be a success, but a smaller amount of console sales ultimately meant that there was less Melee to go around. It wasn't long though before word of Melee began to spread, because just months after release, the game was already beginning to catch major competitive traction. What started off as small local events, often taking place at someone's house or in a small venue, evolved into entire stadiums being used to host, broadcast, and seat thousands of watchers from around the world to tune into Melee's top players. Ever since the beginning, Sakurai wanted Melee to be the prize of the Super Smash Bros. Series, and he made sure to spend all of development doing everything he possibly could to make sure that goal was achieved. A big fundamental part of Melee's uprising over the years has been its rich competitive history. Competitive Melee as we know it first came into existence back in early 2002. Top player Matt Deasy at the time would pioneer the idea of creating and organizing tournament events for the release of the new game. He had dreams of one day bringing top Melee players from all around the world to compete in tournaments organized and hosted by himself, equipped with laid out rule sets, stage selections, tournament procedures, and for him to be the face of a new era of competitive gaming. It took a bit of preparation, but after some careful planning in a few months' time, by April of 2002, Matt had finally launched arguably the most important tournament in all of competitive Smash, the Tournament Go series. Tournament Go was the first fully organized Smash Bros. Tournament that wasn't hosted by Nintendo, and was the tournament that ushered the Smash Bros. We've come to know and love today. Matt had successfully become the founder of the competitive Smash scene, and in due time became the spark to a chain reaction that would carry a legacy of over 20 years on its shoulders. Tournament Go wasn't just important for being the first organized event for Melee, but it was the first stepping stone of generating massive competitive interest in Nintendo's newest fighting game. And by 2004, Matt's tournament was the first of competitive Smash to break 100 active attendees, featuring all of the known faces of Smash at the time. Three players who are famously known for their reign over Melee in its early years, Ken, Azen, and Chudat, would attend this event, and that's what would help kickstart the steady upbringing of Melee as a competitive video game. By this time, though, it was no longer just Matt's game, as other tournament organizations had picked up on the young Melee's popularity and began to organize their own events. Tournaments like Melee FC and Game Over were now springing up from other parts of the United States, and the initial surge in popularity from these events was enough to lead the game into what's known as the golden age of competitive Melee. By late 2004, Melee would kick off into its golden age with the biggest tournament opportunity the game could have possibly received at the time. Major League Gaming was going to include Melee into this year's pool of events, and this was what really kicked off Smash as a competitive fighting game. Major League Gaming was one of the biggest tournament organizations in the United States at the time, and had picked up on the upcoming Melee's potential and decided to give it a chance with its own iteration of events. As to be expected, top players would flood the gates to be a part of this massive tournament. Returning masterminds like Ken, Azen, and Chudat would once again make attendance, but this time they had other competitors that were there to challenge their thrones. New upcoming players such as Isaiah, PC Chris, Korean DJ, and the prodigy, Mewtwo King, were going to be at this event as well, and came more prepared to win than ever. At the time, it was Ken who was seen as the best in the game. Nobody understood how to play Melee quite like Ken did during his reign. He dominated almost every event that he attended for numerous years on end, and things were looking no different coming into Major League Gaming's events this year. Unsurprisingly to most, Ken would take first place in at least one of these events. However, his reign was beginning to come to an end. By 2006, it was PC Chris who had made a name for himself by winning the first place $10,000 prize pool at one of Major League Gaming's final Melee events, one of the moments that eventually led to Ken's inevitable retirement soon after. In the following year, Major League Gaming would drop Melee from its ever-growing pool of games at the time. However, by then it was actually Evo who would pick up on the now 6-year-old Smash game. Evo is undoubtedly the most prestigious and widely respected fighting game tournament organizer in the world, and their inclusion of Melee this year was looking like a new light for the fan-favorite Smash game. Games that make it to Evo are often held in the highest respects, so the fact that Melee was capable of reaching such a platform was nothing short of unbelievable at the time. Contrary to the community's hopes, however, Melee came into Evo not with open arms, but instead receiving serious backlash from the rest of the community. Players who were already familiar with the Evo scene shunned the very unorthodox style of Super Smash Bros., claiming it as only a kid's game, and since it was originally released as a casual game, it meant that it didn't belong at a tournament like Evo. For a long period of time, other players would seemingly celebrate Melee's downfalls and mourn over its victories, and any sort of solution seemed to be nowhere in sight. The criticism would keep striking until unfortunately leading the game into what's known as the Dark Era, and the beginning of the Five Gods. By 2008, Melee's existence as a competitive Smash game would be questioned with the release of the newest game, Brawl for the Nintendo Wii. Brawl would understandably hold the spotlight of the Smash series for a little over a year after its release, and during this time there were no major events held for Melee. Melee's competitive scene would remain stagnant for quite some time, until Alucard, a previous top Melee player, would host a tournament fittingly named Revival of Melee that would finally be the much-needed kickstart to Melee's return. Revival of Melee was especially important for the game because many of Brawl's players would transition back to Melee after experiencing the far less appealing iteration of Smash they played for a little over a year. Brawl was notably slower than Melee in pretty much every way. The game had marginally less speed and combo capabilities, and gained a reputation as the much lesser title compared to Melee. While tournament organizers like Major League Gaming and EVO would hold on to Brawl, the underground fan base of Melee players would be the ones to keep the game alive until new opportunities would arise. And, as fate would have it, that's exactly what happened. In less than a year after the Brawl hiatus, Melee had been picked up by new organizations like Genesis and Pound, and once again reached viewership numbers that came to be similar or even better to that of Brawl's. One downside of the revival of Melee came at the downfall of some of the previous top players. This was around the time where faces of Smash like Ken, Korean DJ, and PC Chris would make their retirements from the franchise for good, which was definitely a big loss in terms of the game. However, on the flip side, this meant that there was new opportunity for new top players to emerge, and that's exactly what happened. Mango, Hungrybox, Armada, Mewtwo King, and PPMD respectively were inarguably the kings of Smash by this point. These 5 players held a level of domination that no other video game had ever seen. During the reign of the 5 gods, every single major and super major event from 2008 to 2015 wouldn't see a victor that wasn't one of the 5 gods. The only people who could beat the gods were the gods themselves, and it was astonishing to see such dominance from top players in such a competitive esport. To accompany the beginning of the 5 gods was an unprecedented spike in player attendance once again for competitive Melee, and a sudden surge in popularity that was previously forgotten. Better days were looking ahead for the now 12-year-old Smash game, starting with EVO's return to Melee with the Melee It On Me event of 2013. This year's EVO saw a staggering 709 attendees, putting it way above the previous best at Pound 4, which only had half the players of this year's EVO. Strangely enough though, it was actually Nintendo of all people who had stood in the way of this tournament. Nintendo had become extremely hostile to the idea of Melee events seemingly out of nowhere, and even went on to fully cancel the event entirely. People were shocked, as this was the first time Melee had ever been interrupted by the company of their creation, and with seemingly no warning of any sort either. It took an unbelievable amount of convincing from the community, but Nintendo thankfully went on to green flag the event once again before it was too late. And the excitement and energy that this tournament generated led to the increased esports attention once again for Melee. Organizations like Cloud9, Evil Geniuses, and a few other big names would pick up Melee players as part of their team roster, and after EVO 2013 and 14, things would remain on a steady incline for Super Smash Bros. Melee. Ever since the era of the 5 gods, Melee has continued to thrive well into 2022, with Apex 2022 being the most recent event, and a new set of top players have begun to emerge and take the title as best in the world. Now that we've covered some of the history of competitive Melee, it brings up an important question. What's so good about Melee as a competitive fighting game that's allowed it to stay alive for so long? When understanding what goes into making Melee as popular as it is, I like to think it boils down to 3 prevalent factors: characters, stages, and ruthless technicality. Melee's roster comes with one of the most interesting lineups of characters in all of Smash. It's pretty universally agreed upon that about 9 of Melee's 26 characters are competitively unviable, meaning they are fully incapable of winning any major tournament event. Another 9 are competitively viable to some degree, meaning that they have potential to win, but still have very little results to showcase their capabilities. And the final 8 are fully capable of winning tournaments in any capacity, with some more than others.
Come on!
These 8 characters, also known as the high tiers, tend to have multiple strong positives with very little negatives to counteract them, usually making them the most reliable and common characters to see in tournament play. The list generally tends to include these characters: the space animals Fox and Falco, Jigglypuff, Marth, Sheik, Captain Falcon, Peach, and the Ice Climbers. The space animals are often seen as the face of Melee, as they represent the game's meta of sheer speed to its maximum capacity with insanely fast combos and movement capabilities. Puff, on the other hand, is the polar opposite, coming to be criticized for being the absolute epitome of what Melee isn't about, relying on a floatier, more punish-oriented style that ultimately leads matches to be much slower. One other aspect of Melee's competitive roster is character matchups. It essentially compares the hypothetical odds of one character's victory over another character with the same skill level based on research into the positives and negatives of the 2 characters. In other words, who's more likely to win in an even fight? A good example of this is observing the Sheik-Marth matchup. If we take a look at Melee's official tier list, Marth is objectively seen as the second best character in the game just behind Fox, and Sheik is seen as the 5th best behind Falco, so theoretically, Marth should have the winning matchup. However, if we look at the newest character matchup spreadsheet, we get to see that, in fact, Sheik is the only character in all of Melee who has a winning matchup against the sword-wielding Prince. While the ratio is only a 5% advantage for Sheik, nothing major by any means, it could mean the difference between a win and a loss for a Marth player at the highest level. Character dynamics like this are spread everywhere throughout the game, and they can help a viewer extend their understanding of a player's choice on who they main and why. Some players even opt for having 2 main characters simply for the sake of certain matchups. Famous Pikachu player Axe, for example, primarily plays Pikachu at any time he can. However, he does have a backup Falco on hand in case of an unfavorable matchup such as Sheik or Captain Falcon, 2 characters who tend to have very favorable odds against Pikachu. Once you have an understanding of the differences in character matchups, it puts the tournaments you watch in a completely new perspective. If you know your favorite player makes it to Grand Finals and wins against a character who technically they had unfavorable odds to, it helps make their victory all the more impressive, and shows that they won despite having odds favoring against them. It helps give people stakes, and it helps keep matches interesting too, 2 aspects to what make competitive gaming so popular in the first place. Once people began to understand the depth of the characters in its early years, it immediately became clear that Melee had serious potential compared to Smash 64. Everything from combos, character movements, animations, hit stun, knockback, and movesets were greatly improved to initiate a faster, completely new style of Smash gameplay to emerge. Melee would also introduce a few X factors into the game through means of character-specific moves, some of which were completely dependent on luck, but none even came close to undoubtedly the most important one, Jigglypuff's Rest. Anyone who's watched competitive Melee to any degree is probably familiar with what Rest is, and knows the destruction it has the potential to cause. Jigglypuff is notoriously the lightest character in the game, meaning that she dies off screen incredibly early. However, the same factor applies to anyone who has to go against her because of this one move. By cleverly timing a close encounter with your opponent, and pressing down and B in a close proximity, Puff will fall asleep. But if her opponent is anywhere in that hitbox, they're almost guaranteed to not survive.
Got the normal blast zones, good layout. And we're into
Dan,
it
we're in
already.
Battlefield, and he starts with a rest.
Reaction rest.
We don't even have time to commentate. There's a rest. Like it's okay. I don't. No. Don't continue.
No, not twice,
Not
bro.
twice.
Don't do it to him.
I don't want to see a set.
I just
full
talked
of,
him
oh
up.
my God.
I just talked Seb
What's
up.
going on?
And
I
he
don't
just
want to
gets
see
destroyed
12 rests
in
right
10
now.
seconds.
It's not. Oh my God. Oh my
I have to
God.
say it.
Matsi, come.
Having X Factor components like this aren't necessary for the game, but having them around to give an extra layer of possibility is part of what's made Melee still so popular after all these years. Next, I'll quickly cover the stages. Besides some jank and small oversights on some of them, the stages themselves aren't too interesting, but to be fair, they aren't exactly supposed to be either. It's the characters that bring the interest into the stages once again. Because of each character's individual strengths and weaknesses, some are better on certain stages than others. Characters like Yoshi and Luigi, for example, are very dependent on stages with platforms to make up for their lackluster range and give them a lot more mix-up capabilities, while cast members like Marth and Sheik thrive on stages with fewer platforms because of their preference for more ranged attacks. This opens up a whole new aspect of character matchups too, because a character who has an unfavorable match can actually counterpick a certain stage in order to gain the upper hand, and the same applies the other way around. Only 6 of Melee's 29 stages are tournament legal, those being Yoshi's Story, Final Destination, Battlefield, Dreamland, Fountain of Dreams, and Pokemon Stadium. Every other stage in the game is either oddly shaped or has external factors that could determine a player's win or loss, such as damaging environments. Before recent rule set changes, Pokemon Stadium was actually a stage that would change environments from its base 2-platform format as the game went on. Players over time came to dislike this factor a lot because not only was it against the original philosophy of why only 6 stages are legal, but it led to some seriously ridiculous ways of people losing tournaments.
All right, can SUJ put together a Johnny Stalker? Are we going to see Plup go up 2-0 for the first time? Could we see... Oh, what the hell? Whoa! Are you kidding me? The Pokemon glitch in top 8 at Shine. Unreal.
Freeze this map!
this map!
I love that.
this map! That's right, the crowd is right!
Eventually, tournament organizers came to the agreement that a frozen version of Stadium was the most reasonable course of action, keeping it at its original 2-platform state from then on. Aside from that though, that's about all there is to say about the stages. It's really the game's technicality where things begin to look interesting. There are a lot of techniques that play into competitive Melee, so much so that a lot of spectators probably aren't aware of all the tech that's going on during just a single match. Because of the game's intentional techniques combined with the uniqueness of the engine it was built on, Melee came out as an accidental technical masterpiece. Melee's controls come as pleasantly free-form and tight as they are fascinating to watch. Very dynamic combos can be created because of a lack of buffering between inputs, and characters' movesets are more catered for fast-paced chaining of attacks. Between techniques like wave dashing, wave landing, shield dropping, L canceling, DI, and plenty more, lies a game that's come with over 20 years of mechanical optimization. When it comes to competition, nobody displays the mechanical capabilities of Melee better than Mango, the undisputed mastermind of Melee's tech. Mango sets the bar higher than what any other Smash competitor could ever dream of, performing simultaneous inputs so fast that it forces his opponents to either match his performances or simply hope they're able to punish if he messes up. Mango's Falco is one of the most feared individuals in the entire game, and here's a short demonstration of why.
Wow, he is chasing it.
And certainly MTK's feeling the pressure.
Oh man, what I really like that Mango does a lot, especially against that.
Yeah, okay. With these conversions.
Oh my god!
Mango!
Melee is admired for its fast pace, blitzing speed gameplay, and the game's seemingly unreachable skill ceiling is what's allowed it to pull off this style. What sets Melee apart is the much more apparent skill gap between high and low level players. In newer Smash games, for example, someone who hasn't played the game long doesn't look all that different from a veteran who's been playing the game competitively for multiple years, and there is a reason for this. Sakurai openly states that he has a strong disliking to more apparent skill gaps in his games, claiming them as more casual games created with no intent to compete, and displays a philosophy that catering too strongly to a competitive audience isn't what himself or Nintendo create games for. With this in mind, it's sad to say that there will probably never be another game quite like Melee. But luckily, Nintendo seems to be a lot more at peace with the idea of Melee competition still taking place. And because of this, it's what's allowed Melee to still thrive after all these years. The state of competitive Melee today remains in a really good place. Returning major and super major tournaments host, broadcast, and present high-level Melee to thousands of viewers from all around the world. Events like Smash Summit, the Big House, Pound, and many others bring the top players together not only to compete, but to simply enjoy their favorite game each and every year. New players like Yoshi Main Amza are famously debuting characters who've never won major events before into the realm of possibility. And slowly but surely, the game is coming closer and closer to reaching perfection. Watching Melee now compared to its early days doesn't even look like the same game anymore. Matches are fast, free-form, and usually don't even last half of the 8-minute time limit they're given, with player matchups at a constant push and pull to see who reaches the top in each respective year. If you ask me, I don't think there will ever be another fighting game quite like Melee. Between everything this game has to offer, and all of its past glory, lies a standing group of people always encouraging the game to be at its absolute best, and do everything they can to keep the game more alive than ever. Even if you don't see Melee as a competitive masterpiece, I hope I've at least convinced you that it one day has the potential to be. Because I do understand that deeming something as a masterpiece is a pretty prestigious tag, since the game isn't even perfect by any means, and it's hard to say exactly where Melee will be in 5 years from now, even 2. But until then, we have a true masterpiece on our hands to treasure for all that time to come. So thanks for watching. And as a tribute to this game's legacy, please enjoy a small montage of some of my favorite competitive Melee highlights from over the years.
You think that you're tough, you're kinda like Kirby and that you just suck. So try take him down, he don't give a fuck. He's got your number, the number one puff. He don't need a shine, he don't need no luck. He don't need a secondary to keep up. He's drilling you down and smashing you up. Time and again, he's coming in clutch. You think you're so good with your Falco and Frost. He's taking the glory, taking your stars. Rank number one in case you forgot. Like it or not, he's kind of a god. He's dominates the scene. With 5 jumps, burying you right off the screen. With the headpiece covered. The rest is history. You're talking his pound, bearing and fearing and tearing you down. He's singing to sleep, so don't make a sound. Rock you to bed and knock you out. You better watch out for his grab. Coming in hot like the throw of a crab. And then when he wins, assuming he's mad, he'll pop off and punch and you're kicking the time. You think you're so good, but you're facing the boss. He's taking his time, you're taking a loss. Not number one in case you forgot. Like it or not, he's kind of a god. He dominates the scene. With 5 jumps, burying you right off of the screen. With the headpiece color green. The rest is history.
Oh my god.
At Evo 2016, 2 stocks to 1, I'm facing defeat. Up there to finish, I got to his feet. October 2013, losers finals, BPMD. Best of 5 at Big X. GTS 2017, bracket reset versus a sweep. Down scouts 1 to 3. All of these moments and so many more. You can challenge them all that you want, but you never win. Some of the greatest games Melee has ever seen. Rest is history.